For this week's video, I want to go through another layout design. This one has actually been in pipeline for a long time now. Now, although he has a huge basement, not all of it is available for the railroad. We experimented with several different shapes. Originally, the railroad was to occupy the northern half of the basement, although it was quickly moved to a more central location. It took us a few attempts to get the overall boundaries correct. And of course, at the moment, I'm not drawing in the aisles or anything like that. I'm just trying to find out the limits of how much I can use. At this point, we thought that the extent was about right, and he decided that he didn't really care to keep the office in this corner and that I should go around the back as well. There's an electrical panel on this wall, hence the need for an open area. And there was some fluctuation as to how much space he wanted for the family space in this area. But once we got a pretty good idea of how much of the basement he wanted me to use, we came up with some various footprints. This was the one that looked very promising to start with. Although I tried several others, I kept coming back to version A. Note how some of these use up more space than others. The two red arrows are shown in exactly the same location in all the plans, just to give an idea of how much space is used up by each one. Now, before I get too far into the design, I need to give a little background. The client had been very much influenced by a model railroader that displays his work on YouTube a lot. I don't know if many of my viewers have heard of Arthur Houston. His railroad is known as the Grande Pacific. And if you haven't done so already, his layout is well worth a view. It is a triple deck layout, 2 full scenic decks with a lower staging deck. And that is what my client wanted. Now also, Arthur's Grande Pacific has a very high track density. With all his industries, only the rail side is modelled, because he wanted to get as much operation as he possibly could in the space. And my client wanted to do the same thing. Although the idea behind his layout is somewhat different. Being from Minnesota, he was very much interested in iron ore hauling. And you've probably already noticed the name that I came up with, railroad, the Missabe Western. And although the layout is entirely freelance, he has a very definite idea of the area that he wants to serve. So after that aside, let's start drawing the layout in a little bit more detail. Here is one of the first drawings where I drew the main line into scale. The idea is to use the 2 long walls for his main city area. Now, although there are 2 large windows on this wall, he told me just to cover over them. Remember, I said that because we'll come back to it later. And here is the entire layout drawn out, all 3 decks. We have the lower staging level, which only occupies about 2/3 of the railroad. Then we have the main level, which is going to be mostly city area, representing the city of Duluth. Everywhere from the ore dock around the outside, and the first long run in the middle of the layout represents the city of Duluth, and then we're gradually getting more rural as we go. And then the idea is that the very last scene on the lower level is a junction. One route will head up to the upper deck, and the other one will go back down to staging over these 2 stacked helixes in this area. And here is the upper deck. The main line comes out of the helix, retraces the route over the lower deck, and then divides just before the end the main line to the upper staging yard and the branch line to an ore mine. And he also wanted a significant logging area. And there was a good long run for his logging line, invading part of the office area. Now, when I presented the customer with this drawing, he was very excited to proceed with the detailed design. So I started fleshing out various areas. This one is labelled version 5. Originally, the freight yard was along this wall, sharing space with the locomotive servicing facilities, and the passenger terminal was along the other wall. But it didn't quite work, so the 2 were switched around. Now notice this junction here is fairly key, because with a layout this size, one can't expect to build it all in one go. So the idea being that we have a cut-off track. In phase 1, the main line goes straight from the freight yard to the helix down to the staging yard. So with the two bottom decks extending along the outside walls, you already have a continuous run, and that is the extent of phase 1. So the main line continues out into the middle of the room and rejoins just before the helix. So the two lobes in the center would be filled in with phase 2. As shown in the next version, note my circles in the aisle. I'm trying to keep a 42-inch aisle throughout. There's one narrow spot between the two central lobes where it's down to 36 inches. Now, if you recall, I mentioned earlier that the customer was inspired by Arthur Houston's Grande Pacific, but one area where they differ on is aisle widths. Arthur has nice wide aisles in his train room. I think they're in the region of 4.5 feet wide, whereas my client for this design kept wanting me to squeeze in more and more layout at the expense of the aisles, whereas I was constantly trying to keep the aisles as wide as I could. So as we mentioned, phase 2 would fit in the middle of the room. Then not till after the bottom two decks were complete would be add the second helix and head up to deck 3. Here is the staging yard design. The idea is that each track is long enough for 2 trains. I put a reversing loop under the helix at this end, and in later plans I added one under this helix as well. Note how there's also a pair of crossovers for universal access from either main to any yard track. And once again, I eventually added crossovers at this end as well. Here is a version with a lot more of the details filled in. You may notice that the major passenger terminal has been chopped out. The client at this point decided that it was more important to have a good sized ore yard. If we go back to the previous version, we see that the ore yard was rather restricted in the corner, and he felt that I was taking up too much space with the passenger terminal. He also wanted more space for diesel servicing. Initially I just had this one 3-stall diesel shop behind the steam terminal, but he wanted to expand that. So by getting rid of the full passenger terminal and just putting a local passenger station in the corner, left this entire area for a good sized ore yard, and the corner where the ore yard used to be could now be used for diesel servicing facilities. And he liked that arrangement a lot better. We still have a good sized freight yard, we still got the junction in the same place. We have the phase 1 main line going straight to the helix, and once phase 2 is in, that will just be a different company's route. The idea is that we'll have more than one railroad sending trains into the visible portion of the railroad, of the layout. So around the end of the aisle and all the way down the peninsula, we have a lot of industries of various sizes. The other side of this same peninsula, we're devoting a lot of space to a large paper mill complex. So this one town here is basically a one industry town, although there are 2 small industries at the other end, just to provide a contrast. And at this point the main line goes to single. Now originally we wanted the main deck to be double tracked throughout. Then he thought about the added possibilities with dropping it to single track for part of its length to require planning the meets at sidings. So we have a fairly long single track section here, and then there's a long passing siding, actually with a crossover in the middle. It's a pair of lap sidings, so you can meet multiple trains there if you need to. And then we have the junction, the twin stacked helixes I told you about earlier. This version is labelled 5H. So of course now we have to come off on the staging level in the opposite direction. We've still got the pair of crossovers and the reversing loop. I've shown how the mini peninsula under the ore dock can be used for additional locomotive storage. We've still got the long staging yard, 2 trains per track. And here I have a pair of crossovers. I split them, one here and then one on a short straight between this curve and the helix. And also got a reversing loop underneath the helix. And these extra routes in this area allows the same reversing loop to also turn trains in the secondary helix, because we've now decided to use the remainder of the lower deck as visible mainline run for a different route. If we go back to the main deck quickly, we see that only the outer track of the helix is the main line. The inner track, we're now using the alternative route. So instead of being a double track helix at this end, it's now operationally 2 single tracks. Anyway, at this point it seemed as though everything was going really well with the design, and then the bombshell hit. If you recall earlier, I told you there was 2 large picture windows on this wall which the customer had just told me to cover. Well, it turned out that his wife wanted the natural light in the family room, so this layout design wasn't going to work. We had to move it away from the windows, which basically means that even though we're 3/4 done with the design, we've pretty much got to start again. This was the next footprint that was tried. Instead of ending this end of the layout at the oar dock, we've wrapped it back on itself and eliminated most of the other end of the layout. Instead of 2 full-size peninsulas, we now have 1 short lobe. Note how the aisle between them lines up with the main window, and I pulled the benchwork out 2 feet away from them. Originally it was going to be 30 inches, and then we cut it back a little bit. And we worked on this idea for a while. Now with more space between the main freight yard and the ore dock, we've got room to put the passenger terminal back in, because we now have the extra lobe where the ore dock could be on the next run. But after a while he concluded that he didn't like this footprint. He wanted to move the railroad completely away from the windows. And we thought of 2 possibilities, either going back to using the northern half of the basement or anchoring it from this area and moving out into the middle, leaving the south wall open. Here is that version, what has been referred to ever since then as a pair of legs with 1 foot. And although it looks like it still blocks the windows, we decided that these 2 interior walls that we need to anchor the top deck on will not go all the way to the ceiling. It does have a higher than normal ceiling in this basement, so we can leave this area completely open above upper deck height, allowing plenty of natural light to come through. So as I said, this is the one shape that we experimented with, and here's the other, where we'd use just the northern half of the basement. We quickly decided that we didn't like this one. The main problem is this fireplace footing midway along the north wall, which cuts most of the railroad into a series of short sections. And the final straw on this one was that he'd already commissioned some very expensive built-in cabinets in this corner of the basement. So we abandoned this one and went back to the pair of legs design, as it was later dubbed. Here I've made one alteration to it. By shortening the 2 peninsulas slightly, it moves them back far enough away from the south wall to get another section of the city in, which is a great opportunity for an interchange with another railroad company. And it would be accessed via a swing bridge that would only be closed when it was necessary to do an interchange run. So normally it would be open to the aisle. Note how none of this track work is actually drawn properly at this stage. I've just cut and pasted chunks of the railroad from the previous design. Here is the main freight yard put in 2 separate places, the ore yard down here, the engine terminal at the end, and the ore dock. Now, although his original suggestion was to put the freight yard on this run, I suggested that we moved it to the back aisle and use this area for the passenger terminal, which he now once again decided that he wanted to incorporate. This section being slightly shorter than the second one, and also I felt that a passenger terminal and city centre would be a lot nicer scene to have presented on the family room side of the railroad. Also bearing in mind that that and the ore dock are going to be the first scenes that visitors see when they descend his basement stairs, whereas freight yards tend to be ugly places, and therefore a good candidate for hiding it further back. Here is what I proposed for the upper deck. We still have exactly the same schematic as we had before, with the main line following the aisle, dividing about 3/4 of the way around, the main line continuing uphill to an upper staging yard, while the branch line continues at eye level to an ore mine, once again with the logging line diverging from the main at the top of the helix. Now, since we have the electrical panel in this corner, it is necessary to wrap it around on itself to gain enough height to get over the top of the electrical panel, and then we can run around over the top of his workbench, then over the top of the windows on a narrow plank, and then have switchbacks down back to eye level to put the logging line over the city interchange area that I showed you on the previous drawing. And here is the staging level. With the new shape of the layout, the 2 visible ends of it are fairly close together, so it's practical to have the 2 main helixes one inside the other. So now we have what looks like a 4-track helix although it's actually two concentric two-track helixes. And then both ends of the main line diverge on this peninsula for the east and west staging on opposite sides of it. And the rest of the lower deck will be devoted to just a long scenic run, no turnouts, no switching, because it really is too low to comfortably operate. But it'll be a great height for younger visitors to watch trains running. He also liked the idea of representing the main line following the north coast of Lake Superior, while the whole of the middle deck is now representing the city of Duluth. Here is one of the cross sections that I drew, showing how it fits into the room. Here are the windows, the first aisle, second aisle, the two peninsulas. The nominal heights for the three decks are 24, 44 and 64 inches. And then upper staging will be above the lighting valance along just one portion of the layout. And for operating the upper deck, there'll be a series of pull-out step stools which normally will reside underneath the benchwork. Whenever shorter operators need to access the upper deck, they can pull it out to give themselves a better operating height. Now at about this time, I turned the layout round in third planet. Since most of the long straight areas were running north to south, I turned the layout through 90 degrees to make it easier to view them on the screen. And here we see that I've started drawing in various areas in a lot more detail and outline just how much of the layout is proposed to build as phase one. Now unfortunately, with the new layout shape, it's not practical to build enough of the layout to get a continuous run in phase one, because that requires both the peninsulas. But the client was okay with not having continuous run to start with. His plan is to go immediately into phase two as soon as phase one is operational. Now from this point there have been many minor adjustments and improvements. This version here, where we first started talking about building the layout, is labelled version 12. This one is labelled version 20. So we can tell there's been a lot of improvements. Here is the staging deck. You see we have east and west staging side by side. This reversing loop squeezed in between the two serves both ends. So for example, if we're in west staging, we have the crossover at this point, take the inner track, the reversing loop under the helix, and then come back out again. Similarly, from east staging, we could do the same thing using the other track. And then in the center of the lobe, there is room for extra steam and diesel locomotive storage areas. Now this track curving around at this point, although it looks like a Y, is not a Y. You see there's no connection at this end. I told you earlier that it's two non-connected concentric helixes, but this cutoff allows for a continuous run entirely on the lower deck without having to use the helixes. We figured that would be great for when his grandkids come to visit. They could have fun chasing trains all the way around the layout. And later he asked me to put a similar cutoff on the main deck behind the helix, so that he'll have multiple continuous runs for when he just wants to let the trains run for entertainment rather than operating intensely. Note all the crossovers in this area. These two that I'm pointing out now with the mouse are alternative locations for the same equivalent crossover. I wasn't convinced that the alignment was appropriate to allow me to fit it in here, so the backup was to use straight turnouts and put it one lap up the helix, which you may notice has been elongated, because with the helix being 4 tracks wide, I didn't think 4 inches of separation was sufficient to be able to reach in comfortably. And since this area here was only a staging yard, I can use the air rights over it, adding a pair of 3-foot straights down both sides, giving an extra 6 foot of length, and therefore an extra 1.5 inches of separation per deck. So now we have fewer laps further apart, making it easier to reach trains if we need to. So let's go back to the main level. Coming up from staging, we arrive on the visible portion under a bridge and curve around narrow benchwork in front of the helix. There's a short industrial branch into this corner near the electrical panel, and here we're going to have the Walters Valley Cement Works and a few smaller industries. Notice how I've differentiated between main line and secondary trackage. I've done that because he's decided he wants to go with code 83 on the main and code 70 elsewhere. So I have to figure out exactly where the changes are going to be made so that I know what turnouts to provide. The two main routes converge at this point, single line main heading up another helix to the upper deck. And we've gone back to having the entire main deck double tracked. And then there's a third route diverging at the same junction, because late in the process I realised there's space for a 2-track staging yard to wrap around under the city and end either here by the fireplace foundation, or if longer tracks are required, under the back of the ore yard. That allows for interchange runs from another railroad company. This other track just goes a few feet past the bridge. It's the switching lead for the paper mill. It doesn't need to be very long. Now all the trackage behind the main line is one large paper mill, and then we have a few smaller industries in front of it. There's a small mill yard at this end, 2 tracks for pulpwood delivery, mill buildings in the background representing the first few phases of the process. And then we have the bark chip loading track, several chemical delivery tracks with separate spots for covered hoppers, box cars and tank cars. Then we have a track leading into the power plant, an optional spur with a single stall engine house, just in case he wants the paper mill to have their own locomotive with somewhere to service it. Then we have various other mills with tracks disappearing into them, and finally a large paper warehouse at the end. And there's just about enough height separation to allow the chemical and bark chip loading tracks to extend under the diesel servicing tracks a short distance, just to give extra storage capacity. Heading around the end of the peninsula, we have our main freight yard, which is pretty much the same as it's been from version 5. 4 arrival departure tracks at the back, 7 classification tracks and a thoroughfare track at the front. We have a single rip track, twin caboose tracks, one for the Missabe Western and one for foreign road cabooses, short run round, and 2 tracks serving the ice house. Then at this end, the yard lead becomes a connection track to another railroad company on the opposite side of the river, although we haven't decided which railroad that's interchanging with. We'll make that decision later on when we get to build it. There are a couple of different railroads serving that region, and we can choose any of them, just as for this 2-track staging yard that I mentioned earlier. Now at this end of the freight yard, we once again have 3 diverging routes. The double-track main line continues around the end, past the ore yard and the steam engine servicing facilities, around the end of the other peninsula, through the city centre and passenger terminal, before disappearing off stage again and heading back down around the inner helix. And behind the main line is the junction to the ore yard along the opposite side of the aisle, and from there across a steel viaduct to the ore dock, which is off the bottom of the screen on this view. The yard lead runs around inside the main line. Then we have another switching area at this point, downtown freight house and team track, and a couple more industries. And this 3rd track eventually becomes the line dropping down to the general merchandise harbour, which shares the foot with the ore dock. Now something else that has probably become apparent to my viewers as I've been describing this layout is the very high track density. I mentioned earlier the client's inspiration from a Grande Pacific Railroad, which is another one with a very high track density. And a couple of times during the development I tried to reduce it somewhat, but every time the response from the client was, no, add more track, I want more operation. Now although this first part of the railroad, where I've drawn in the landscape, is already under construction, the design for the other sections is by no means set in stone. There will still be plenty of time to improve these areas during the construction of phase 1, and I will probably present further installments as other areas of the design are finalised. So I'm just going to wind up this video at this point. Hope you all found it interesting, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.